Hi, my name is Frances Pollock.
I'm Allison Chu.
And you are listening to another episode of Miss Opera Music Mister, a podcast exploration of trends and biases in contemporary opera and how they reflect the world at large.
This podcast was developed out of a research project about gender bias in contemporary opera reviews, and we realized that the issues were much more interconnected and sprawling than we could explore in just one academic research paper. So, we turned to our friends, colleagues, mentors, and role models to help us out.
Welcome back to Miss Opera Music Mister. As you remember from last time, we were deep in conversation with Shola Fadiran talking about what critics prioritize as their job. Here's where we left off.
This leads really well into my last statistic for this section, which is critics strongly believe that they have a duty to educate the public about classical music and why it matters. 90% of those who answered the survey feel this way, and nearly 2/3 strongly agreed with this description of their mission as critics.
I don't like that.
Wait, that's really interesting. So they believe that their mission is to make people think classical music matters? I don't really see how criticism does that. I mean, maybe, I guess in a way, no, I don't really see a legitimate way in which classical music criticism is also convincing people who don't think classical music matters that it matters.
Yeah.
It sort of exists outside of the world of people who don't care about classical music. So I'm like, where is the part where it's like, there's an engagement with people? Where is the engagement with those people in the first place?
Yeah. You know? I mean, to me, it feels pretty elitist, right? I'm with the critics when they're trying to give their perspective on a piece, when they're actually leveling a critique at something that they're observing. But this idea that it's their job to, I would love to hear what a critic said about this, because my gut reaction is to be oh, I don't love that. That feels exclusionary. That feels elitist. That feels like prioritary in a way that puts classical music at the top and all of these other musics at a lower rung in the hierarchy, which probably that's probably not what they mean.
I mean, I think I can understand the feeling of I critique this music because I want people to take it seriously. I want it to be looked at with nuance and with respect, and so I take care to watch. I understand that, but that to me is developing a respect for the art form within the community that engages with it. I don't really understand how the criticism of a certain art form reaches outside the people who engage with that art.
Yeah, and also maybe a rewording of it is to develop critical thought around and develop a critical skill of engaging with classical music. But again, I mean, I'm in a doctoral program at a conservatory studying classical music, and I have never been convinced that it means all the things that critics say it means.
Yeah.
And so at a certain point, I'm that's a priority difference. That's all that is. I can look at the Eroica Symphony, and I can say that's a really pretty melody that that comes back in this way, and that's really kind of clever, but it still doesn't do the things that classical music critique has professed it to do over time, for me.
Mm-hmm. Well, Anne Midgett, in this Forte podcast episode from October 6th, 2020, so this is a very recent episode, says, and this is a direct quote, I transcribed it, a critic's job should be to break down the passivity of the audience, to try and get the audience to have their own opinion, not my opinion. Disagree with me, that's even better. My job is not to tell you how to think.
I like that better.
Well, to me, but that's still, to me, is you're engaging with your audience. And I understand that statement in that way, that it's engagement with, it's creating a respect. It's creating an environment in which your audience has a more nuanced, or develops a more nuanced view of the art, more detailed engagement with whatever art form. And I think that can uplift an art form for perhaps amongst those people. And maybe therein lies the making it an important thing, or maybe a cultural institution or whatever, because there is something, I think, heavily critiqued art forms are often just, people just view them as high level or academic, or if we were to like develop, I don't want to say anything's low level, but if I was to make an art form off of ripping paper, and we were to develop like years of like nuanced critique about how to rip paper, what ripping paper is, what it means, like what it's done for audiences, like ripping paper, the technique of ripping paper, how perfecting it can like say so much about the human spirit or whatever, then now ripping paper might become a cultural institution because we have all this documented critique about it. And I understand that's the thing that happens. It becomes like more academic. People feel like something that's heavily critiqued or like looked at with a lot of nuance is nuanced. Even though that might not be true.
Can I play devil's advocate here?
Yeah,
so I completely agree. Like I am on your side about all of this, and I completely.
This is not my side. I'm just trying to understand this person's point of view.
Well, and I'm wondering, like, maybe this is a better way to ask the question. Have either of you ever been introduced to something new via someone's writing?
Oh, all the time. Yeah. I feel very insecure about my understanding of film, very insecure. And so I like it when someone tells me that something is worth seeing for whatever. I mean, I watched Taxi Driver the other day with Robert De Niro.
Yeah.
And I had just read an article that had like sort of compared Taxi Driver to another film that I had liked, and I really liked the person writing about it. And to me, like that made me want to go see Taxi Driver and like understand it. Do you know what I mean? But that's me being insecure about like my lack of knowledge in film.
But you watch films.
I mean, I love films, but I feel very like I'm like a neophyte.
But it's not like you've never watched films and then you read something about films and they were like, oh, okay, watch it. I think that to me, I'm like, I have, in terms of something, a new art form, I've always been introduced to new art forms or even like extremely new genres of an art form by a person, by a real person, like who's asked me to engage with that art form. But I don't think I've ever been introduced by reading an opinion piece. So I think I've been introduced to new works of art within art forms I already engage with. Yeah. Like me going to Rotten Tomatoes is only because I love film. But if I didn't like film, I don't think that Rotten Tomatoes, I mean, like if I'd never seen a film, I don't know that Rotten Tomatoes would make me. I mean, maybe it would. Maybe like seeing someone saying like, because the opposite is like, oh, you've never seen a show, but you're walking down, you've never seen a musical, but you're walking down in New York City, and then there's a sign that says New York Times said, this will be the best theatrical experience you'll ever have in your life. And that was literally what they said for Cynthia Erivo. They said Cynthia Erivo, it was something insane. Like Cynthia Erivo is like, which she deserved, by the way, she's amazing. But it was like Cynthia Erivo is like, Cynthia Erivo's performance will be the most life-changing performance you'll ever have in your life. It was something like that, like hyperbolic.
I would see that. Like, I would see that marketing, and I would be like, "That's a lot to live up." Like if I was Cynthia, I would be like, "Okay." And that I think that can make somebody want to go. But that to me is like marketing, and like it has to do with like that is taking criticism from someone, and that's what it's also a public engagement. Like I walked by the theater and I see this thing. You could see that also on like online for sure. But that is people's writing. So in that sense, absolutely, I guess like, I don't know if that's happened to me, but I guess you could be like engaging with things from someone's writing. But I don't think outside of like a marketing push, which I guess doesn't matter if it's outside or inside a marketing push, right? But I do think that there's something interesting about people thinking that their opinion piece is like, I don't know, it's engaging outside their audience. At that level, 90% of classical music critics think they're engaging outside the audience, which I would say actually is they're not engaging outside their audience. Right. Like a lot of the time. I mean, sometimes they are, but like I think that I would say like I did not get into classical music because of anybody's opinion.
Well, they're saying 90% think that they have a duty to educate, not necessarily that they're reaching outside their audience, but I think like they probably aspire to reach outside their audience, right? I mean, if they think that educating their public is part of their mission. Yeah. Critics strongly believe that they have a duty to educate the public about classical music and why it matters. 90% of those who answered the survey feel this way, and nearly 2/3 strongly agreed with this description of their mission as critics.
Oh, okay, then yeah. I was thinking I think I misheard, and that they thought that they were doing that their criticism was doing that. But I think that the aspiration to educate, like that, yeah, that's something that's actually kind of, there is something. I don't think it's about classical music, because classical music is so exclusivist in this country and so related to at least how we, yeah, actually, no, it is. Like, there is like I would say most forms of classical music are exclusivist in America. And I think that for me, I don't know if I would say that's a beautiful thing that people are trying to educate on it in that way. Maybe it is. But I do think that criticism in general, trying to educate, is so cool, because someone who's trying to educate on like, who's critiquing like abstract Black New York theater or something like that, like that, them critiquing it as an opportunity to educate outside of their audience is an amazing aspirational goal, I think.
I feel like educating, their duty, the duty, they're describing it as a duty to educate, is particularly worthwhile when they're reaching beyond the standard canon, though, right? Like, if they're just,
that's what I mean.
Yeah, if they're just reviewing the same things performed by different people, okay, maybe there's something new and interesting in each performance, but do we really need to spend all of these reviews talking about the same thing?
Like, this is my thing, is that, like, actually, I think as classical music has wanted to become broader, I don't trust the 54-year-old white male who has a conservatory degree to be able to engage in critical thought in a way that I would want that person to. And again, this is my bias, like, this is my worry. But when I hear that, like, like the critic feels like it's their job to educate, I mean, it takes a really special person to be an educator. Not a special person. Well, I guess a special person who has done a lot of work in the field of education. And I think I was just gonna say, like, I think that we have seen that critics do tend to tend to put their foot in their mouth, but they have put their foot in their mouth. They say silly things. They don't know how to negotiate the role of society and art.
Yeah. I was going to say, I wrote an opera. I was supposed to say I wrote an opera. I have never written an opera. But I did write a paper at my conservatory undergrad that was called, I titled "The Death of Opera in the U.S. and the Natural Evolution of a Stagnant Cultural Institution." And one of the things that was the little research that I did in there, which we're going to have to fact check, because I don't remember what this, I reread this paper like I had never written it. I was like, I don't remember writing it, but I did submit it. Yeah. But one of the facts was that in the last, from the time this was written in 2016, and when La Boheme premiered in 1900, it had only not been in 8 seasons at the Met.
I have heard that.
116 years.
Yeah, I've heard that statistic before as well.
Here's the fact check. La Boheme was presented at the Metropolitan Opera in 59 consecutive seasons after its first appearance, and it has appeared in all but 9 seasons since 1900, making it the most performed opera in company history. This information was published in a program note from the 2019 to 2020 season production of La Boheme at the Metropolitan Opera. And now back to Shola.
That is what happens when your critique is constantly reaffirming the same things.
Yeah.
That of all the new composers who have written amazing work in 116 years, that one slot basically at the Met was always taken. By La Boheme, by one composer's work. Yeah. That has to do with review, with marketing of that piece, with also the other things, exclusivity, deification of works. Like, there's a lot of things I think we could talk about that and it creates actually a stagnant cultural institution, not one that's moving forward. So if the point of criticism is to educate and to if the mission is to bring more people to the art form, to move the art form forward, to have a more nuanced look at the art so that it's progressing somewhere, or so that it's actually a cultural institution that more people are engaging with it, rehashing the same old actually isn't the way to do it. And that includes criticizing just certain things, which goes back to what we said about only criticizing art pieces with celebrity,
right?
Art pieces with the same big composers.
Yeah.
Only getting, I mean, this has to do also with monetizing your publication and other things that we can talk about. But I think it is important that like it becomes part of criticism as a whole in this country, that you have to criticize things that are outside of popularity, because then otherwise your art form will die.
Right.
You'll be part of the process of killing your art.
Stagnation is a great word, for a lot of that reinforcing of the canon rather than anything that I would think to call education.
Yeah. It's funny. It's just, oh, sorry, go ahead, Allison.
I want to throw in some more statistics for us to chew on here.
Okay.
So I want to dive a little bit deeper into the approach to criticism, since we're talking so much about the mission of criticism. According to the survey, critics answered that their top priority was to provide an accurate description of the purpose, location, and feeling of a particular performance. Second in this priority list was to describe what they actually hear, i.e. the oral experience, so the timbre, tonal character, technical description of the sound produced.
This explains a lot to me about criticism that I don't think I've fully put two and two together. So there is this let me tell you what I saw and how I felt about it. And I am growing less and less convinced by this educational piece because I do want to hear what someone if you're I saw this play, and this theater in New York, and it just blew my mind, and the people were amazing, then because I know you and because I appreciate your taste, I'm gonna be all there to go and see it. But if you Shola are I need to educate you on why this is brilliant, and you have no idea why this is brilliant, and only I can see it, I'm not about that.
Yeah.
that feels so condescending.
It's also I mean, there is something fun, right, about reading someone's analysis of something you love, and it being it confirming things that you saw, or elucidating things for you that you're oh, I never saw that, but you agree with. Mm-hmm. You're yeah, that's exactly that brings to light feelings that I had about this piece or whatever. But it's never fun to read a piece that's explaining to you why you're not good enough to understand, or that you're not smart enough or human enough. I don't really get it. I think it's anti-art to think that art must be explained. Mm-hmm. I think that there is a human experience. I mean, yes, there needs to be education, right, on in art, because it allows, to the point that it allows people to engage with their full selves, mm-hmm. in what they're listening to and what they're hearing, and to and give them forms to express and play with, but not to tell them that they're less than or greater than, or that they're or that there's an objective truth to art, or objective goodness or badness in terms of the quality of an art. That the point is that it's all completely subjective. Yeah. And that if someone's talking down to you or educating you on why you don't understand something, they're actually working against, I think, the goal of most artists, which is for it to be a human reflection, a human experience, that you're supposed to be able to see something and have your own experience with it. Yeah. And that experience is, ostensibly supposed to be valid.
Cherry on this line of thought here. And even fewer emphasis was placed on providing either historical or theoretical context for the works, composers, or performances being reviewed. So we're talking 28% and 22%, respectively.
Oh yeah, no, this is getting worse and worse. It makes me think of Stalin and the well, that really famous story about how Shostakovich premiered Lady Macbeth at the Minsk, and it was a success. It was so everyone loved it. It was premiering in Moscow, and then Stalin came through and saw it and had everyone tear Shostakovich to shreds. He published in the media, he shut it down. It was he was this is dangerous art.
That should be our test. That should be the opener section of our paper, Francis.
Okay.
Ooh.
I love that story. I mean, like Shostakovich literally had to go in the media and say like Symphony Number 5 is a reflection on my failings in this opera. He had to create art that then that apologized for this opera that a critic, I mean, like a very powerful political critic, but like a critic nonetheless, didn't like. And so like, yeah, Allison, that last statistic, I mean, it just feels more and more to me controlling, you know, like I'm not going to put context around it. Like I'm not going to place this piece in history. Like I'm going to, you know, just qualify it by like, you know, sheer merit alone. And it's just like,
it's also like, what is that? I don't know. Like, I really would love to speak to someone that was a part of this research, because I'm wondering why, like, why not put context in historical context to the work that you're reviewing? It's a part, no one is creating their art form in a vacuum. And it sort of adds to this idea that there's some sort of objective way to create art. Mm-hmm. There's some sort of neutral way where you're not a part of the era that you're in.
Right.
When actually that's the you're a part of.
And I feel like, you know, knowing what we know, having done our research, Francis, like that doesn't line up with the fact that every time a female composer is mentioned, they have to talk about, oh, they need to qualify and build up the reputation of this female composer in that same review.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
It's interesting that people are saying that they don't need historical context, but with female composers, that's all they do.
That's all they
historical
give.
Context.
And it's like so-and-so won these prizes and these grants in order for this opera to happen.
Yeah. Then they place them in the canon, like right next to like the male counterparts, right?
Is that is that what we mean by historical context?
Well, historical context could be, you know, talking about like the form and where did this form come from, and what is the precedent for this genre, this particular style of music.
I guess I'm thinking very much in the like actual content, like this so-and-so is in this part of the world because, or this woman is writing post-World War II a lot of her content right now. And the reason why this character goes through this arc is likely because her in her life, she was seeing all these other women or men working in this way, which influenced the way she thought about the, you know, post-whatever industrial complex. Right. And that's why this whole art form, and that's also why the director decided to put, you know, polls, and that's how, to me, that's like historical context.
Yeah.
But like, I guess historical context can be anything, and there's historical context that is what I'm finding out from both of your research, is that there's historical context that's actually used to diminish certain people's writing because it's excluded in other people's writing, which gives the air that the actual falsehood that the other people's writing is neutral, that it exists outside of the influence of anything else, and that these people's writing, their writing is actually contingent on the fact that these other things have happened for them.
Exactly.
It's interesting.
That is a fabulous summation of a lot of our research, is that like there are certain people for one reason or another that get to exist without qualification.
Yeah.
And then there's kind of all these other people who all have to be qualified. And a lot of that comes from a desire to be progressive and to fix things. But like, what does that actually do to the shape of history?
Yeah, that's really, and that opens up a big can of worms that we could talk about in terms of just like how we talk about change, how we talk about
that's a big can of worms.
Progressive. Because criticism is like part of the historical, like the way we mark history, right, within the arts. So it's going to mark how we think about progressive movements, about progressive trends, about change in the industry, you know, whatever these like catch-all terms, whatever they even fucking mean. But like criticism is an important aspect of those things. And it's interesting to see that critics are kind of doing like critic virtue signaling by qualifying these things rather than just doing the work of looking at the work, you know what I mean? And just critiquing the work as it is, which I think is actually progression, right? It's looking at things on an equal playing field and engaging with them, with all of them in the same way, which means that like everybody's work actually should have historical context to it, because nobody's neutral,
right?
Versus like nobody's work should have historical, or we shouldn't feign a neutrality to people's work, which we only do for certain people who we, I think, across all things, consider default neutral people, you know, the most human versions of people.
I love feigning neutrality. That's great. That's great. That's got to go somewhere in life. We got
paper.
Okay.
You can quote my art, my paper. I would love to be a source on this. You never actually
like a footnote.
A footnote says show up here. That'd be sick.
So now I want to move into what do classical music critics have to say about their own profession? Because I think like we've now talked a lot about maybe what we're thinking they're doing, and obviously we're trying to be charitable about their intentions, but now we can actually hear what they say. So these are some quotes that I've pulled from them writing about their own profession in, you know, music, in these like publications. So Alex Ross wrote a piece about criticism and the dying arts journalism profession, kind of arguing for arts criticism and saying like criticism. So the quote is, criticism is cumulative. Its impact can't be measured by however many hits one piece receives.
I kind of buy that.
Criticism is cumulative. Yeah.
I thought that quote was really interesting because it kind of speaks a little bit more to the education initiative that so many of these critics are trying to do, but also to the greater movement and the impact, you know, the collective effect. And I think that's also what we're trying to measure, Francis, in our research, which is really hard to talk about. You know, how can you say like, oh, just because, you know, one piece got a review, does that mean that piece will be performed again? Will that piece get another performance? Will it get more opportunities? Will that composer be able to then get another commission, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, totally.
Joshua Cosman from the San Francisco Chronicle says, I like to think I present as a fairly genial person, and yet being a critic inevitably means inflicting dismay on at least some of your fellow creatures. There's no way around it. Like any endeavor, the arts are prone to constant failure of imagination, of aspiration, of technique. And if you write frankly about the arts, calling those failures as you see them, then someone's feelings are bound to get hurt. Conversely, if a critic isn't making anyone unhappy, they're probably doing it wrong.
I don't know.
I don't know about, I mean, I guess like in the sense that you can never control what's going to make anybody unhappy when you're speaking to them about anything. In that sense, I agree. But in the sense that criticism, even just when people work, the word critique, it's like you'll even see positive reviews, critical reviews. It's like almost like we've like created this word, we've changed the meaning of critique, or maybe we used to have this meaning of critique, or I don't have this meaning of critique, I guess, that is negative, that being critical means you're being negative, or it means you're being like it can be negative, right? Absolutely, and it's appropriate for it to be negative sometimes. But the idea that critical review is only done well when someone's feelings are being hurt is a weird way to look at your work, and it's actually almost like a narcissistic way to look at the way that you critique things. Because I actually think that constructive criticism, holistic criticism that takes into account the whole thing, the process, the development, the product, the beginning, the history, the people, the time, can actually be uplifting and super critical. It can be full of scrutiny and full of solutions for problems, and still someone can still read that and be like, oh, okay, yes, I can't wait for my next project. Right. This makes so much sense.
Yeah.
The idea that your feelings need to be heard, I think it has way more to do with the ego of critics than it has to do with the actual process of critiquing work. And we know that as artists. I would say if you're a performer in any way, you understand that that's the truth. Because to collaborate, you have to be insanely critical with your collaborators. As a musician, as a singer, as an actor, and that doesn't actually mean hurting their feelings or tearing them down. Collaboration is about scrutiny. It's about criticism.
Yeah.
And that's how you get the best work, actually. The most positive outcomes come from that.
I also think, I think you're totally right. I also think it totally backfires on critics to critique something super negatively, because like I did a deep dive into Spider-Man Turn Off the Dark like this past week, because I was like, what is this thing? Like, you know, I like looked through the numbers. I looked through like the production. Well, I was trying to like
died on that.
Well, like people who got hurt.
Yeah.
So I did I did this deep dive, and they got slammed with bad reviews. Like they were like, this is the worst thing to ever happen to like American theater. And it ran for 4 years. Like it ran for 4 years because people were like, is it really that bad? I have to see it.
Yeah.
I have to see this train wreck that is this like this money pit, and this like, you know, this like there are all these media personalities that caused it to run for 4 years. So I think that a lot of times, like if critics want the best art, be critical in a productive way. Otherwise, you might end up engendering something that is going to stick around sheerly out of like spectacle.
Yeah, I think whenever your criticism is constructed in a way that uplifts first and foremost your singular genius or your unique perspective versus actually the criticism, the work that the art needs to do to get better, the research, the engagement, then your criticism isn't about the art. It isn't about education. It isn't about uplifting anything besides your own ego.
Yeah.
And I actually think so many critics engage with criticism in that way. And I think that's why there is such an aversion from artists, because it's not as if artists are only receiving their criticism from critics.
Right.
You are receiving criticism, I would say, like, for example, as an actor, you are receiving criticism from the moment you open up your play to the moment the show closes. Mm-hmm. It's constant scrutiny, constant rethinking. It isn't free from, I mean, it's ridiculous to think that these people are, the critics are the first people to think critically about your work. And so it's like, but the type of like when we think that, at least that that person's view of criticism, I think that type of thinking of it is so ego-based. Yeah. And it just doesn't have anything to do with, I don't know, the collaborative process of making art. I want to make sure I'm clear that I don't think good criticism should avoid hurting people's feelings. I don't think it needs to be hyper aware of like being super nice or anything like that. I just think that if your viewpoint of good criticism, if the hallmark of good criticism for you is hurting people's feelings, or if that is even like a signifier that you're doing your job really well, then I think that your criticism is about you and not about the work. That's what I mean to say.
Yeah. You want to, ostensibly we're all in this to make the art form better from an artistic standpoint, from a critical standpoint. Like the hope is that like in partaking in both of these roles, the field progresses.
Yeah.
So I want to tie up, we mentioned award shows earlier in this episode. And something while I was doing my deep dig and looking for this information, I also came across an article that Howard Reich for the Chicago Tribune wrote that as a Tribune critic, he served on the Pulitzer Prize for Music jury 4 times.
It's a lot of times.
It's a lot of times. And I find that really fascinating, because if we're talking about critics and we don't really know what their backgrounds are and like how well-versed they are in other types of music beyond maybe just the one that they went to school for or something like that, it's interesting to me to then have them serve on a jury for an award like the Pulitzer Prize of Music.
Yeah. I mean, the Pulitzer in and of itself is sort of like it's a bomb that you just step on when you like start to unpack it, because it's like,
and this gets into award ceremonies and awards.
Yeah.
It gets into that whole conversation.
Yeah.
It's all of awards. I mean, you think of the Oscars. That's a complicated science. The Oscars. Like it's intense.
So this research that I'm finding, and I think, Francis, what we're seeing extends beyond classical music to no one's surprise. But Michelle, I thought it was really interesting that you brought up Rotten Tomatoes really early on in this episode, because USC's Annenberg Inclusion Initiative They did a study that found that film critics are largely white and male. And so this isn't anything surprising, but actually this is 2018. So this is even more recent than that critic survey we were talking about earlier in this episode. So the study is called Critics' Choice, question mark at the end, and uses reviews of the 100 top grossing films from 2017 posted on the site Rotten Tomatoes. Now, this study is different from ours in that critics on Rotten Tomatoes can come from anywhere, but to be a quote unquote tomato meter approved critic, you need to apply and satisfy requirements such as having consistent output for 2 years, a minimum number of subscribers if producing video reviews, demonstrated social media engagement, etc. So you have to be well established sort of in the digital internet space sphere. The study found that 22.2% of reviews were written by females, with 77.8% crafted by male critics. White critics wrote 82% of the reviews. Now, when these identity groups were crossed, white male critics constituted 63.9% of the reviews.
I don't think these numbers are surprising to me.
I don't, but they really confirm a lot of
sad
realities, I think, for art makers.
I think, and I also think that critics themselves are aware of this. I know Anne Midgett like has mentorship programs where she works with I think Imani Mosley has been you know, an interlocutor of hers. And so like, you know, I think that there is a certain amount of just like there's a certain amount of awareness in like all of our fields about like that we need to be sort of reshifting and restructuring the way that we interact with each other. I think that critics are aware of this, and that hopefully I don't know, adjusting their fields accordingly. But like that's not up to us, because we you know, in a way, this is something we actually haven't talked about, Allison, is like, in a way, like it's important that you and I don't interact with critics very much, that we do our thing and they do their thing, and like the magic that happens is just the output from that.
I think that there's artists who are interacting with critics in the sense of like actually writing critique of criticism. And it's like criticism itself has to be, it's just like anything else, has to be peer reviewed. If we're going to take it seriously, it has to be critiqued. It has if we're supposed to take these people, if these people have this much power, as your research has established, then it has to be peer reviewed. It has to be critiqued. It has to be scrutinized. Criticism can't just be, you know, people can't just say whatever they want without somebody coming up and being like, actually, your criticism is so thin and so single-minded and so or singular in terms of its viewpoint, I should say, that it doesn't actually take into account the entirety of this piece from many other critics' perspective. And that might be because your criticism is racist, maybe because you are subconsciously looking at women and the writing of women from this lens that you've developed that actually doesn't reflect what this specific woman has done. It might be, you know, it could be a million specific situations in which you are not critiquing well. Which is actually, it has an adverse effect for all of us. So it has to be scrutinized. So I think that they're in that way, in that sort of engagement, I think artists can engage as their own critics.
Of course.
Critics. But in terms of you as me as an actor, like critics says something to me about my acting, I think you just let it,
It kind of goes back to the idea of the video that we just put out for, you know, commenting on the person that trolled us, who like gave us like actually a lot of very valid criticism. Is that what is so hard about receiving criticism in that like sort of traditional artist critic relationship, is that like that's where the conversation stops. But that's not, that like that doesn't have to be where the conversation stops. It's exactly what you're saying. It's like, okay, let's engage with it. Let's like, you know, tear it apart. Let's like, you know, like really get into it and like, you know, work to understand why things are being critiqued in the way that they are.
I think you're right when you say artists should be careful in how they engage with critics. But actually, like, I mean, I respect what you guys did. I would prefer to have an engagement like that with like a critic who was, you know, who was I think at least at the level of humanity to be a real person in space and say what they mean to my face, or you know, on a digital world where they're an actual figure, versus like just an anonymous nothing. But like, and I also think, because like I would also say like sometimes you had to be a singular artist, like you kind of had to be like careful about engaging with people who aren't critics but trolls, who have opinions that may be right or wrong, but whether or not you engage with them is like a much hairier path.
It can be it can like damage that like vulnerability that like you're supposed to have in order to be an artist. Is it if that I don't know, like for me, I think the idea of like really engaging with criticism is very empowering. It says to me that like the critic doesn't have the final word. I'm still, you know, a worthy actor no matter what the criticism is. I'm not an actor. I was
like, oh, amazing. That's awesome. I didn't know that. Like, but I would also say like as an actor, one of the big things that I think I've learned is, but for myself, and I'm sure I'm going to learn so many things. I'm still I'm like completely like a baby actor. The one thing I've truly learned, like that within performance, that everyone's opinion is not valid. And in fact, most people's opinions are not valid. They may be true, but whether or not they're valid is a personal choice. It's subjective to you. So somebody coming up to you and criticizing your work that you don't trust, that you don't know if their word is legitimate, that you don't know their background, to me, that opinion is just words. Like it literally just flies into my ear and I hear it, I receive it as gracefully as I can, and then I completely ignore it. Unless somebody else has confirmed that criticism or I agree with it myself. But like, to me, it's like, it's actually important for an artist themselves when you're engaging with criticism, at least as an actor, to not take everything in. It'll really have a very bizarre effect on your work. And I think negative effects on your work. If you're taking in all the criticism that you see. Because if you're doing your job well, there will be a lot of criticism. And so you cannot take all of them. You just take the people you trust to be holistic, critical thinkers of your work and scrutinizing your work.
Absolutely. That's it.
So if we need peer review on critical thought, maybe research is the way to do it. Maybe this is our peer review.
I think this article, what excited me about both of your work is that it is research, like an academic look at opinions. Like an academic, factual look at what people's opinions have done over time. Have they served the purpose that we all need them to serve? This is facts. You know, and like, or at least this is an academic interpretation of facts that will be peer reviewed. And so like, I think that is so important.
Shola has just summed up the reason that we are so passionate about the research being done as part of this podcast. Critics and reviews matter in terms of creating a narrative around history. The ways in which we document success and progress will have an impact on future generations, and it is our job to be cognizant of how we tell our stories. Thank you for listening to another episode of Miss Opera Music Mister. If you like what you've heard, please feel free to follow and engage with us on social media. We are on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and would love to talk to you about your thoughts about the contemporary opera scene. Be sure to check out all the other incredible projects being incubated with Midnight Oil Collective at this time. And as always, tune in next week to hear about more discussions about the contemporary opera world featuring our favorite opera scholars and composers. You know, the people who are actually doing the thing. Lots of love, y'all.
This podcast episode was produced by Connor O'Toole.